Hi, I'm Jill Santiago, Director of the Center for Social Justice and Human Understanding at Suffolk County Community College, and this is By Design, the History of Oppression on Long Island, a documentary series focused on the historical roots of many of the current issues Suffolk County residents face. Today I'm talking with attorney and author Mark Torres about his most recent publication, Long Island and the Legacy of Eugenics, Station of Intolerance. Mark, thank you. I think you know how excited I've been to have this conversation with you. It's been a long time coming, and I was really, just looking forward to getting my hands on this book and seeing what you unearthed in your research, and it did not disappoint at all. So before we begin, what made you want to write this book?
Well, I first learned of the topic during my second novel. I was writing a crime fiction novel set in a psychiatric facility in upstate New York. And I learned of eugenics, but thanks for my help with my wife and researching. And once I learned of the topic and I started to poke around into it, I realized this is a really deep subject matter. And I said I'll put it in the can, and eventually came back to it at the right time. And I was just amazed at the scope of the history and also the locality, the fact that this really occurred in Long Island's backyard.
Yeah, it's our backyard. It's happened here, yet the global reach of this can't be understated. So I think before we go any further, because a lot of people have never even heard of this pseudoscience, I know that that's what I hear from a lot of my students. What is eugenics?
Yeah, well, the word alone is coined by Sir Francis Galton. It literally means well-born. It's the 20th century pseudoscience premised on the racist and classist belief that human beings can really engineer childbirth. Like we can engineer racehorses and sunflowers, we can engineer the best babies. But the dark side of that purported science is that what do we do with those who fall below the metric? And that's where the real negative turns come from this. And they believe that those bad traits had to be rooted out.
Yeah, so the understanding what that is and giving us a little bit of the framework, how did it start? What is the birth of eugenics, and how did it end up, of all places on earth, here?
Yeah, well, initially it goes back to the ancient Greek, Roman, and Sanskrit texts. So humanity is not new to the ideals, the aspirational ideals of having, perfect children and not having illness. And in late 19th century, this talk resurfaced again. But make no mistake, eugenics as a practice was made in America, and right here in Cold Spring Harbor, largely by one man, Charles Benedict Davenport, a Harvard-educated biologist, a renowned biologist for his time. He really orchestrated and was the architect of the American eugenics program.
So in the book, you point out all movements require the support and participation of people with strong public influence. So if you could set this in place in time, give us the historical context of what's happening in America maybe, but who were the people that had influence and were maybe the driving force of this?
Yeah, well, certainly Davenport was very strategic in his goals. In 1902, he took a boat ride with his wife to England. He met Francis Galton, got a letter of endorsement to begin a program here. He was able to establish a couple of professional relationships with Henry Goddard, and some other notable scientists of the time, but it all comes down to funding and financing. And his first real relationship in that endeavor was Mary Harriman, the wife of widowed Mr. E.H. Harriman. Really wealthy man, and when he passed, she inherited what today's money would be almost $4 billion. Wow. She was a staunch ally of Davenport, gave him a lot of money for the time, and then later the Carnegie Institute came in and they fully funded the program, which they did really for decades throughout. So, he built on these relationships and then secured the financing, and then the program was really kicked off at that point.
So you mentioned Carnegie. I think a lot of the people of the period at that time, the robber barons, when we think of some of those, a lot of those folks feature in your book, the Kellogg's, all of these other people that kind of have these very complicated histories. Thinking about some of the leaders of the government at the time, where do they fit into the story?
Well, I think the misconception that people will have looking into this initially is that you may think that eugenics was some fringe movement. Hardly it was that. It was, as I call it, the rage of the age. Yeah. It was taught in almost 300 colleges across the United States, including Ivy League, Harvard, Yale, NYU's. It was espoused and promoted by every U.S. president from Teddy Roosevelt to Herbert Hoover. It was adopted in Supreme Court decisions. It was popularized in popular culture and film and movies and literature. And it really was inescapable, and it became a part of the American fabric. Eugenics became a household word and the cutting edge science that they all hoped it would be.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask you about is, understanding that if Roosevelt was behind this and Hoover and, you know, I mean, all of the leadership of the country at that time, then the American public had to be in support of this as well. I mean, when you first learn about what eugenics is, as you said, you think that it would be some kind of fringe movement. It's this horrible thing, but where did the American public stand on it? You said it's a part of the...
Yes. And it was an era where information was limited. You know, conversely, these days we have so much information, a lot of it false information. So, you know, the public was certainly swayed by what they heard, read, and really, even if they wanted to avoid it, they couldn't. It was everywhere. You see one of those pictures we have there of the eugenic tree. It was promoted as this savior of humanity, the way we're going to save our country and become the master race.
Yeah, so if I could, I want to read a quote from the book. It's from Charles Davenport that you cite, and the quote is, "Can we build a wall high enough around this country to keep out these cheaper races?" Yeah. Can you talk about this quote and the intersection of eugenics and the extraordinary anti-immigrant sentiment that existed in this period of time?
Yeah, certainly. That was written in 1920 to a man named Madison Grant, an author, a prominent zoologist, conservationist, and a notorious racist. He had written a book in 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race. Adolf Hitler personally called it his Bible, that book. You know, eugenics had this ability to really run in tandem with popular movements of the time. And certainly the anti-immigration movement was one of the leading ones. The amount of immigrants coming in through Ellis Island from Europe, many Americans railed on it, and racism and xenophobia was very prevalent at that time. And really, you know, when you converge in these two movements, the anti-immigration leaders really enjoyed eugenics because it gave them some semblance of a science behind it.
Yes.
In fact, it actually led to the passing of the Immigration Restriction Acts that restricted immigration to as low as 3% in some cases, including the Otto Frank family, which likely was barred from coming here for those kind of restrictions. So eugenics ran on its own plane as a science or pseudoscience, but it also joined in tandem with other movements of the time, and anti-immigration was one of the leading movements.
Yeah, and I think, I can't be specific about the year, but I mean, you're talking about a period of time in American history when 1 out of 7 people were immigrants to this country. So, you know, there's something very interesting about human behavior and the way that we're always looking to, you know, the other person, trying to label people. So I think, you know, what you've shared so far gives us kind of an understanding of what it is and kind of sets the place in American history. But what did this look like? What does eugenics look like in practice?
Yeah. Well, it was quite an elaborate setup, and that's one of the purpose of the book. It wasn't enough for me to just kind of outlay the pseudoscience and, you know, it was popularized. I really wanted to go into investigate what it was. And essentially it started with data collection. At the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor, it really was, and they developed a training program, and they hired mostly college-educated students from Cornell and Vassar, and they were sent throughout the country with these biased questionnaires and go to families, knock on doors, go to all types of facilities, mental institutions and prisons, and tribal native lands, just to try to get this information and then funnel it all back to the ERO, the Eugenics Record Office, and then build on that, build on the data. They would create elaborate reports and charts and graphs, all misleading, all based on the eugenic ideals. And then they would also want to engage in further studies. I know in 1925, Davenport himself was up at in Letchworth Village, a facility up in Rockland County, and him and 2 doctors castrated a 13-year-old boy with Down syndrome. And you know, of course, the idea was to test the tissue for eugenic purposes, which were, of course, inconclusive. And there was big questions on whether they had proper consent to do that procedure, because the boy's mother was badly disabled too. So, you know, you have this kind of hunt, this hunt to go out and get this data to build on the science. Again, it was sort of already premised on what they wanted to support, and all the funneled information really lent to that.
Yeah, that story of the 13-year-old boy, when I got to that in the book, I just put it down for a second and just said, God, like, this was horrible stuff that we were involved with. And then again, going back to what you're saying about this being a part of the American fabric of the time is just, it's really staggering. And
I'll say, Jill, the records were clear on what their intent was. Starting in 1911, they had prominent meetings in Manhattan, 45th Street, the historic hotel, the City Club, and they talked about ways to deal with the population. Now, they had a name for this group, 15 million Americans, 10% of the population. They called them the submerged 10th. Now, these people were made up of all the false data they were building up. And they created a 10-part plan. Among those parts was marriage restriction, mass incarceration, mass sterilization, and even mass murder. And by 1914, they contemplated killing up to 15 million Americans for eugenics on American soil.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. I think, you know, because the series focuses on Long Island history, I would be remiss if I did not ask you about what was happening to the community here, specifically our Native American reservations, and just to name one, the Kings Park Psychiatric Facility. So can you talk about what was happening there?
Yeah, you know, Davenport had such a, there was a great amount of reverence for him as this budding scientist. And also many of the leaders of these facilities, administrators, they were also had bought into eugenics. So when Davenport made a request to come visit, to see the records, to visit and study patients, it was carte blanche. He had total access to all the facilities. At one point, he made a call to the Museum of Natural History to request 2 skulls of Shinnecock Indians that they had in their exhibit. Sure enough, they sent it to him. On native lands, again, they were building the data to use later to subject them to mass sterilization programs, as much as high as 25 to 50% across the nation. Yeah, sure. And again, it was kind of building the science to totally legitimize what their goals were, and they were horrible goals.
Yeah, another thing that I had never heard, I mean, the statistics and the sheer number of people that this impacted was unbelievable to me. But another thing that I had never heard about that I would like you to speak about, because I'm sure most people haven't heard of this, was the Black Stork propaganda film that was released. Can you talk about what it was and maybe the impact that some of the propaganda around eugenics?
Oh, sure. It was released in 1917. It was fictional. It was about a doctor who counseled a fictionalized couple to not have a child that would likely be, quote, defective. It was, again, a eugenic scare tactic film, and it played in theaters for 10 consecutive years. It was a big hit. Yeah. And, you know, it just lent to the further, and actually it was loosely based on a real doctor named Harry Hazelton, who was a chief surgeon in Chicago. There was an incident where a child was born with bad deformities and abnormalities. He was summoned to view the child. He saw the child and refused to treat it and let the child die, purposely. Again, because he was cleared on the medical panel, and he went out on a tour promoting how he was proud to do it, how he would keep doing it, and that the whole country should do it. This is the kind of fervor, the dangerous fervor, that really whipped up around the country.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you talk about how Davenport and his fellow eugenicists expressed what you call grave concern about genetic mixing between races, because they believed, and again, loosely summarizing, but that they would produce primitive animal-like qualities. Yeah. Can you share what that led them to do? Yeah,
and it's important to point out initially that eugenics was as much classist as it was racist. They would go out searching for, quote, the shiftless whites in the South, or degenerate whites in upstate New York. To them, if it was bad blood, it was bad blood regardless of skin color. And of course, if it was skin color, that would be double the mix for them. You know, they had these terms, defective germplasm. They were really concerned about misogyny, which is the mixing of races. And it was so influential that in 1924, Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act. And that law banned, forbade, and made it illegal for someone who was white to marry someone who had 1 drop of non-Caucasian blood. Yes, yeah. And it encouraged people to report others, and if they were found, there was imprisonment, fines, nullified marriages. This is the extent that how far this kind of rhetoric can go.
So I want to jump to the story of Carrie Buck, because this is, you can't talk about eugenics history in America and not talk about her story. So can you share her story with us? Poor
Carrie Buck, 19-year-old woman, born into a poor family in Virginia. She was placed into foster care. She was basically bartered out by families to do social. She was pulled from school. She was a domestic laborer. She was raped. She got pregnant, and then the parents who were with her last were outraged at this. So they had her committed to a home for feeble-minded children in Virginia. So she gets committed there. A few months later, she has the baby, Vivian Buck. Now, Carrie's mother was already there. Her name was Emma Buck. And they theorized that Carrie was feeble-minded. Now, it wasn't enough that they just wanted to sterilize her. They wanted her to be the test case, to go up to before the highest court in the land, the United States Supreme Court, and prove once and for all that eugenic sterilization is legal and lawful and the law of the land. And sure enough, that's how it happened. They worked their way through the ranks. They stacked the lower case against her. Her attorney was really working with the other side, condemned her with the evidence, and it was ruled by both lower courts that yes, she can be sterilized by the state. and went to the Supreme Court in an 8-1 decision, which has never been reversed. They determined that yes, Carrie Buck can be sterilized against her will, and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote the decision, a mere 5 paragraphs in length, stated at the end, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. The interesting thing about the rhetoric, and remember, this is 120 years ago, words like idiot, imbecile, moron were medical diagnoses. Now, Carrie was diagnosed as a middle grade moron at the colony, but here the Supreme Court's calling her an imbecile. Now that's no subtle difference. Those were big differences, but it didn't matter. Her fate was sealed. And prior to that decision, there were just over 3,000 eugenic sterilizations across 15 states. Afterwards, between the 1930s and the 1960s, there were 60,000 eugenical sterilizations across the land, on tribal lands in Puerto Rico, throughout the country.
I was just going to bring that up because I think that was one of the things that I could not wrap my head around. You said 60,000 between the 1930s and the 1960s. Tribal lands, between 25 to 50% of Native American women. And in Puerto Rico by 1965, 1/3 of women on the island between the ages of 25 and 49.
And it's no coincidence, those are the breeding years they thought to make sure that these women would not continue to have children. A really tragic legacy, and it opened up the floodgates too. And when we say eugenic sterilization, clearly it's compulsory, it's against your will, and it's denying that right to reproduce, a human right.
I want to jump to a quote from Harry Laughlin. Actually, before I do that, I can't get off of those numbers. I can't get away from that. Why will this be the first time that a lot of students are hearing this?
Well, I think eugenics was interesting. Although it was the rage of the age and widely known, once it was debunked, right before World War I, or right around the same, World War II, I should say, it kind of went underground. And then it was converted to genetics, which became it. And I think there's a lot of mixture of, even then, people were swayed by what was popularized at the time, but they never really delved into how deep and complex. But it also had the trappings of a complex science that most people wouldn't dare. And even, I admit, even myself, I was concerned, am I getting into a topic I'm not comfortable with? I'm not a scientist, my work is mostly labor and law. And I realized that was part of the game. Make it so complex that you'll shy away, defer to those professionals who were running the program. And that's how they were able to kind of carry on. And when it went underground, most people were left not knowing what they didn't know in the first place. And that's really, that kind of anonymity just played well with that. Yeah.
So this quote that I wanted to refer to about the global reach of this. So it says, the Eugenics Record Office and the Eugenics Research Association congratulate the German people on the establishment of the new Institute for the Biology of Heredity and Race Hygiene. We shall all be glad indeed to keep in touch with you in the development of eugenics in our respective countries. So this was written to the German people in 1936. So can you talk about that, put that into context for us?
Probably the second biggest misconception with eugenics is that people have the tendency to think that the Nazi program inspired the Americans. Completely opposite. The American program led the way well before the Nazi regime was even in power. And we directly and continuously influenced the Nazi program. And the American and German eugenicists were inseparable. They were closely aligned. They borrowed information. They constantly championed each other's programs. And the leading eugenicist then at the time was a man named Otto von Verscher. And this guy was probably the counterpart to Davenport. They closely aligned. He was part of the Eugenical News Review Board, very active. He hired Joseph Mengele as his assistant to later go into Auschwitz and do unspeakable acts in the name of science and torture. But also in 1936, right around that time was listed, Harry Laughlin, Heidelberg University in Germany, it was a medical school, was having its 550th anniversary. It was a big gala event. Harry Laughlin was issued an honorary degree in medicine for his work on eugenics. He couldn't go, but he thanked them profusely. It was a great honor. 3 years later, the man who wrote that letter, Carl Schneider, the dean of the school, he was behind the Nazi T4 program. And the Nazi T4 program started around 1939. And as part of that program, they killed 70,000 German men, women, and children in mass killing centers, much like you see later in the Holocaust. Carbon monoxide, mass genocide. And it was all done in the name of eugenics. Those people who were killed because they were deformed, disabled, a little off, different, something that they felt were eugenically below the metrics.
Yeah, mental illness.
Mental
really
illness
anything.
was prime, deformity, and this is even, again, pre-Holocaust.
Right.
So a lot of this was really the precursor to the Holocaust, and they used the same metrics and later on just the same tools and instruments.
Yeah, that really built the framework for what they're going to do later on.
Absolutely.
Except that the T4 program, there was some public outrage about what was happening. Of course, you're not going to see the same thing when concentration camps are built
right.
and people are being put into ghettos.
And also, they had a sterilization program. They sterilized in 1 year 56,000 Germans, and the law targeted as many as 400,000.
Yeah, I've heard estimates up around there. So I mean, you're talking about
Staggering.
hundreds of thousands of people that were directly, you can trace the line from Cold Spring Harbor to what's happening in Nazi Germany.
And it's in that direction from Cold Spring. That's correct. And also, I mean, the press was well aware. New York Times, they refer to it as Hitler's cut. Yeah. You know, there's nicknames and terms for it. So it was widely known, and the fact that it continued with the funding that it continued to receive is staggering.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the government in Germany used and Hitler used not only eugenics but even Jim Crow to try to deal with the population that they did not want to see exist.
And even at the end of the war, the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, they cited Buck v. Bell, they cited Harry Laughlin's report to kill 15 million people, and they said, what are we doing that's so different? And obviously the defense didn't go far, but it does raise eyebrows and questions, like what was, you know, this is, it shows the true nature of their inspiration.
Oh, gosh. So I think what I want to ask you about is, what does all of this mean? What is the legacy of eugenics from your point of view?
Well, at the end of the day, eugenics wasn't a science, it was a social philosophy. And it's really hard to kill social philosophy, right? If people want to believe something, they're going to espouse it. You know, there's a lot of enduring legacies from it. In Denmark, they have euthanasia statutes. 60,000 people have already been killed. Now, there are high metrics to get there, but what if it starts to get weakened in a slippery slope? They're creating, the technology creates these growth pods to have these perfect children that you could monitor from your smartphone. You know, what is perfect, what is not? When you hear, even in modern times, dangerous political rhetoric, you know, ruining the blood of the nation, and talks of creating a list for autistic children throughout the country. You know, these are right out of the eugenic playbook, the era of the eugenic playbook, except we know now that the science is debunked, so the fact that this is even brought up without that cloak of a science is even more alarming. It just shows that that philosophy really never went away. It may have went underground. People think certain things that are bad, and it's very tribalistic and us versus them. And I think of one character in particular was Helen Keller. Helen Keller, you know, blind, deaf, mute. She was a staunch eugenicist. Yet she would have been one of those of the submerged tent. There were 10 groups. Number 10 was the blind, deaf, and mute, defective sensory organs. She would have been one dealt with a part of that group. Yet she still espoused it, knowing what it meant for people like her.
Yeah, that's always incredible to me. Looking at people in history that stood for some of these policies and others that would have been killed or really negatively impacted by their own decisions is really extraordinary. Yeah.
It's the dangers of hypocrisy, where if I'm safe and my family's safe, I can turn my back on, even if it's the same race, culture, whatever demographic, that you could just rationalize that away. It's horrible, but it is part of humanity, and we see it time and time again.
Yeah, so I can't thank you enough for your research. Before we close, I would love it if you would just read the last paragraph of your book, because I think it really sums up everything so perfectly.
Sure, thank you. The Eugenics Record Office and those who directly operated, controlled, and funded it are fully deserving of the blame for the entire eugenics movement and the dire atrocities committed under the banner of this false science. While we must continue to honor the seemingly countless victims, we must also provide public discourse and educational programs on the subject, for if we fail to do so, we may be in danger of repeating this dark history.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your research. Thank you for doing exactly that and creating dialogue around this really important subject. And I see that you're speaking everywhere. The book is going all over Long Island, and I'm really happy that we had this time to share. And I'm very excited to share with students.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mark, thank you so much for sharing your research with us and shining a light on this chapter of our local history. I know I'm going to be sharing it with my students for years to come.